Since the outbreak of COVID-19, Senator Cruz has been at the forefront of the fight against the pandemic, both in the Senate and in Texas, and has been an increasingly vocal critic of China. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Senator Cruz. Before we talk about the COVID-19 crisis, I wanted to take a few steps back, going all the way back to 2016. Looking back, how do you feel about your 2016 campaign? What were the values you ran on, and do you still stand by them?
Well, sure. The campaign in 2016 was an incredible journey. It was breathtaking. When we started, we launched the campaign in March of 2015, March 23rd. And at the time, it was very much considered a long shot campaign. We were not given much of a chance. The media, the New York Times, scoffed at the candidacy, said we didn't have a prayer. And then there were a whole group of other candidates that were expected to be the obvious nominees. And if you'll recall, in 2016, we had a total of 17 Republicans running for the nomination. So it was a very crowded field. And it was a strong field. It had an enormous amount of diversity in it, had a lot of young, dynamic candidates in the race. And what we ended up seeing in 2016 was nothing short of breathtaking. We saw a grassroots coalition come together. I think people were frustrated with Washington, and they were frustrated with politicians, frankly, in both parties, who said one thing and did another. And they were looking for a leader who you could count on to actually do what he said he would do. And it very quickly became a two-man race between me and Donald Trump. And we ended up seeing this grassroots army come together. Our campaign raised $92 million, which is the most money any Republican has ever raised in a presidential primary in history. That came from 1.8 million contributions. And we had 326,000 volunteers across the country. And it was incredible. It was young people, it was women, it was men, it was working men and women. Our coalition were truck drivers and firefighters and cops and steel workers and waiters and waitresses and students. And it was working people who were fed up with Washington. And we ended up at the end of the day winning 12 states and just shy of 8 million votes. But ultimately Trump prevailed. And so he beat us. It came down to the two of us and he beat us. And I would say that election, in a very real sense, was a screw you to Washington election, which I understand the sentiment. I think that was a sentiment behind both our campaigns. And I think at the end of the day, the voters found a candidate who they thought was an even greater screw you to Washington than I was. And so that's where we are today.
So during the campaign, you were one of President Trump's most vocal critics. However, during the 2018 midterms and ever since, you have been close allies. Could you talk to us about how your relationship with President Trump has developed since and how you found common ground after this bitter rivalry in 2016?
Well, the primary, like many elections, was bare knuckles. I mean, it was hard fought. He was fighting to win, and I was fighting to win. And we had race after race after race in the primary. We had that he was winning, and we had race after race after race that I was winning. You know, if you go back to March and April of 2016, there was a 3-week period where I won 5 states in a row, all by double digits. And in any electoral contest, particularly a contest of consequence, it's going to be hard fought. And that was no exception. We poured everything we had into that race. Afterwards, I had a choice to make, and it was a choice I wrestled with, frankly. The concerns that I had raised about Trump were real. We had real reason to doubt at the time that Trump would follow through on what he promised he would say. And so I struggled with what to do. You may recall at the 2016 Republican National Convention, Trump asked me to speak at the convention. I did speak at the convention, but I didn't endorse him at the convention. And it was a fairly rocky experience with a number of hardcore Trump fans booing quite loudly, which is an interesting experience in a stadium of 15,000 people. I ultimately ended up supporting Trump and wrote an essay as to why on a whole series of issues that I believed what Hillary Clinton was promising would be affirmatively harmful for the country, and what Trump at least said he was going to do would be affirmatively quite helpful. And I compared those two. And for me, the most pivotal issue was judges. And in particular, Supreme Court nominations. I care deeply about the U.S. Supreme Court. I think the U.S. Supreme Court has seized authority over a great many issues in the United States that ought to be decided in the elected branches. And that's an issue. Much of my life before I was in politics, I was a Supreme Court litigator. So that's what I've done for most of my professional life. Trump had put out an initial list of 11 potential judges he might consider for the Supreme Court. And he said those 11 or anybody else. And there were no words of restrictions. It was literally, of the 7 billion people on planet Earth, it could be these 11 or anyone else. When I ended up supporting Trump, I negotiated conditions, which is that he put in writing that he would be bound by that list and only that list. And so he ended up expanding the list from 11 to 21. And I added Mike Lee, my colleague, senator from Utah, who I think would make an extraordinary Supreme Court justice, to that list. And he put out in writing a commitment that for the seat to replace Justice Scalia, it would be only somebody from that list. And that was put out, I think it was a Friday morning. And we coordinated the two so that when they put that statement out, within minutes, I put out my endorsement of Trump at that point. And then I went and campaigned with him. And then when he got elected in November 2016, I again had a choice to make. And I ended up deciding, I got on a plane and I flew to New York. I went to Trump Tower and I sat down with him and I said, Mr. President, we have an historic opportunity right now. The American people have given us control of the executive, control of the House, control of the Senate. That doesn't happen very often. That is exceptionally rare to have unified control. And it would be a travesty to waste it. And so I told him then, this is a week after the election, I said, Mr. President, I want to do everything humanly possible to lead the fight in the Senate for us to deliver on what we promised, for us to do what we told the American people we would do. And I will say, 4 years ago, my principal hesitancy in supporting Trump was concerned that he would not follow through on his promises. As we sit here 4 years later, I've worked very, very closely with the president. I speak with him probably anywhere between once a week and once every other week. It depends on the issues and what are happening, but we speak together frequently. And one of the reasons that I work with him so closely is that following through on the promises we made, I think, is incredibly important. And I have to say, the president has done what he said he would do. He has followed through on those promises. There have been battles in the administration over whether to do so. There have been voices in the administration that wanted him not to. But I've engaged very vigorously in those battles. And in a great many instances, he has agreed with me and not with the voices urging that he not follow through on his promises. So I think in terms of results, we've seen remarkable results. Before coronavirus hit, and obviously this pandemic has changed everything, but even just 3 months ago, the economic results we were seeing in the United States were extraordinary. We had the lowest unemployment in 50 years. We had the lowest African-American unemployment that had ever been recorded. We had the lowest Hispanic unemployment ever recorded. And so I was deeply gratified by the policy victories we were winning that I think are really important, and that we keep winning, but now we have to address them in the context of a global health pandemic and the crisis that it has precipitated.
You said how important the Supreme Court was to you in this whole process. So I was just wondering, what do you make of Trump's appointment of Justice Brett Kavanaugh, especially in the wake of the hearings that were so controversial and so widely viewed across the world with Christine Blasey Ford?
Yeah, I think the behavior of Senate Democrats during the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings was disgraceful. I think they turned it into a circus. The allegations against Justice Kavanaugh had been raised months earlier. The ranking Democrat on Judiciary, Dianne Feinstein, she had those allegations on her desk months earlier, and she sat on them. The Democrats sat on them and did nothing. And it wasn't until the eve of confirmation that they released those allegations.
Was that not, sorry to interrupt, was that not due to a decision by Christine Blasey Ford herself deciding whether or not to come out with them?
So if it was, then Senator Feinstein broke her promise to her because nothing changed. Dr. Ford asked for it not to be made public. Nothing changed until Feinstein leaked it to the press. So Feinstein doesn't get to say I was honoring Dr. Ford's wishes when she leaks it to the press and thrusts it in the public. You can't have it both ways. You either were sitting on it deliberately, or you involuntarily outed Dr. Ford. One or the other has to be true. And there is an intermediate path, which is actually how confirmations are supposed to operate, which is we have the FBI. We have the ability to do investigations. We have the ability to have closed hearings. You don't have to drag someone through the mud publicly as the first step. If the objective is to find out what happened, the responsible thing to have done when that allegation had come in is to ask that the FBI investigate that allegation and report to the committee in closed session. That would have been, given that Dr. Ford had asked that matters be held confidential, that would have been the responsible thing to do that respected Dr. Ford's privacy. That's not what Senate Democrats did. Instead, they played games. They sat on it, leaked it to the papers, dragged Dr. Ford through the mud. And what followed then was a political circus. And it wasn't designed to get to the truth. It was designed with a political objective. They wanted to defeat Judge Kavanaugh. And by the way, Dr. Ford's lawyers were recommended to her by Senator Feinstein. Dr. Ford's lawyers were hard left partisans. And what the Senate Judiciary Committee ended up doing, I think, was exactly the right thing. When the allegations came in, Senate Republicans on Judiciary, we met together in a conference room and discussed, okay, what do we do? And my view was vigorous. I said, we need to have a hearing. We need to have a hearing soon. We need to have Dr. Ford testify. She needs to be given a full and fair opportunity to present her case. And we need to listen respectfully and hear what she has to say. And then at the same time, we need to respect due process, which means Judge Kavanaugh needs to be given a full and fair opportunity to defend himself, to tell his side of the story. And I said, we and the American people need to watch and listen and judge and make a determination. And that ended up being what happened. There were some on the committee that said, no, we don't need another hearing. We'd already had one hearing on Judge Kavanaugh. I think it would have been a mistake to try to push through. I think the allegations on their face were serious, and they deserve to be treated seriously. And so we did that. At the hearing, Dr. Ford was given a full opportunity to testify. I will say politically, I think the Democrats expected Republicans to step on a rake. They expected Republicans to have some oafish moment where you have some old white guy cross-examining an alleged victim of sexual assault in a way that was condescending and dismissive. And I think much of the entire Democratic political game plan was tee up a moment where a Republican senator seriously mishandles the situation. And I got to tell you, in the scope of history, that was not a bad bet that there was a good likelihood of that happening. We spent significant time working to make sure that didn't happen. So, for example, I urged my colleagues, I said, look, for questioning, we need to bring in an outside counsel. It should not be the members doing the questioning. None of us wants to engage in anything resembling vigorous questioning of this witness. And I said, the outside counsel we bring in to lead the questioning needs to be a woman. She needs to be an experienced prosecutor. We did bring in an outside counsel and an experienced prosecutor, and I spent quite a bit of time talking with her. There were a couple of us on judiciary who are experienced litigators and who spent a lot of time talking with her about strategy. And the principal strategy that I gave her with Dr. Ford is I said, I want you to be unbelievably gentle, respectful. I want you to bend over backwards to treat her kindly and simply let her tell her story. You can ask follow-up questions to draw out a little bit more of the story, but the objective is not to have a Perry Mason moment where you, aha, I've proven your testimony is wrong. That is not, you are not to treat her as a hostile witness. You are to treat her with respect and dignity and as gentle as possible. And I remember the midst of that hearing, I was sitting there on the bench and friends of mine were texting me, like arguing, what are you guys doing? Your lawyer is terrible. She's not scoring any points. And it's like, well, look, we're not trying to score points. We're trying to let her tell her story fully and fairly. Now, then when it shifted to Judge Kavanaugh, I told the lawyer, I said, I'll tell you what, you don't have to be nice and gentle with the judge. Get in there and rough him up a little bit. Ask some hard questions. He's a big boy. Press him on this story. You've heard the testimony. When he gives his defense, push back. Be a prosecutor. Push back a little bit on what his defense was. So we had several rounds of questioning where she did that. At that point, the Senate Democrats had started, I think, really to put on a political show. And I think they ended up overplaying their hand. They were performing. You had three members of the committee who were planning to run for president, and it was fairly obvious. They were all but launching their presidential campaigns from the confirmation hearing. You may recall Cory Booker had his Spartacus moment where he declared, I am Spartacus, and violated the Senate rules by releasing something that was confidential. It was one of the more humorous moments on that committee. Once the Senate Democrats had become clownishly partisan, we told the outside counsel, okay, you're done now. We can handle this. We're not going to beat up on Dr. Ford in any way, shape, or form, but we're more than happy to beat up on the Senate Democrats. And when they start playing politics, we're quite comfortable pressing back and pointing out that they're playing politics and engaging in gamesmanship. And so the way the hearing played out, actually my take on it, as soon as the allegations broke, what I told my colleagues, I said, look, rewind a couple of decades to Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. when Clarence Thomas was nominated to the Supreme Court and Anita Hill had serious allegations of sexual harassment. The only way Judge Thomas became Justice Thomas is we had a national hearing. The American people got to listen to, look at, and hear Anita Hill. And they got to listen to, look at, and hear Clarence Thomas. And they got to make a decision. Who do I believe? At the end of, I'm a human being. I work in the workplace. I interact with people whose story resonates as true. And although the media seems to forget that today, at the time, about 2/3 of Americans said, listening to that story, that they believed Justice Thomas in that story, that they did not believe her allegations. Having heard both the witnesses, about 2/3 of Americans found his story more credible. That's why he was confirmed. And he was confirmed in a Democratic Senate, which is an interesting observation. Here, with Brett Kavanaugh, you had a similar breakdown, although we are a more partisan time. So with Judge Kavanaugh, it almost entirely broke down party lines, that Republicans believed him and Democrats believed her. I think it is illustrative of what we're going to see on future nominations, which is a willingness to go ugly and nasty to try to destroy someone's life, which is what I think they tried to do with Judge Kavanaugh. And at the end of the day, for me, I voted to confirm Judge Kavanaugh because Dr. Ford's testimony was not corroborated. And in fact, all of the corroborating witnesses, all of the corroborating evidence contradicted her testimony. And, we have a legal system, we have courts of law. Conflicting testimony is not an unusual situation. That happens frequently. And that's some of why you want to be able to see the witnesses in person to judge what they're saying. But when Dr. Ford's testimony and Judge Kavanaugh's testimony were in sharp conflict. They cannot both be true. In the face of that conflict, you look to what other corroborating evidence there is. The friends of Dr. Ford that she said she confided in, well, those friends contradicted her story. The FBI did an investigation at the back end. We should have done it early on. We did an investigation, had an FBI investigation on the back end. And so the FBI talked to all of the relevant potential corroborating witnesses. I read through the interview reports from the FBI on every one of those witnesses. I sat down in a secure in a secure basement and read through every one of them. And the corroborating evidence not only did not corroborate her testimony, but it contradicted her testimony. And that, for me and for a majority of the Senate, was sufficient to confirm it.
Senator Cruz, I think what you've just said is indicative of these far, far wider issues which need much more discussion surrounding the Me Too movement. But for the interest of time, I think we will move on to the 2018 midterm elections, which you won against Beto O'Rourke, fighting one of the most expensive Senate races in history. What do you think of Beto O'Rourke's popularity and success in 2018? And has this election driven you to reflect on your politics in any way?
Well, it was another very hard-fought election, which I have to admit that's the only election I've ever been in has been a hard-fought election. Rewind 6 years earlier, 2012, when I was first elected to the Senate. I was 41 years old at the time. I'd never been elected to anything. In fact, I joked the last thing I was elected to was student council. And my opponent was the sitting lieutenant governor of Texas. He had universal name ID, and he was personally very, very wealthy. He was worth about $200 million. And so we went through a campaign in 2012 where when I started, I was at 2% in the polls. The margin of error was 3%. Which is actually, those are the real poll numbers. Heidi pointed out to me when she heard that, she said, well, technically, couldn't you be at negative 1%? It's like, well, yeah, thank you, sweetheart, but yes. That election, we were outspent 3-1. We had $30 million in attack ads just hammering us statewide. And that election was a grassroots election. In fact, in many ways, it presaged the 2016 presidential election, two elections that nobody gave us a prayer, and that our support was the grassroots. It was young people. It was little old ladies. It was working men and women who were fed up and wanted a change, wanted a candidate who would actually follow through on what he said, who would actually fight for individual liberty, who would actually fight for the Constitution, who would fight against the bipartisan corruption of Washington. And we ended up going, in 2012, we went from 2% in the polls to winning the primary by 14 points and winning the general by 16 points. And it was described by the Washington Post at the time as the greatest grassroots victory in the country. And it was. Okay, so fast forward to 2018, what you asked about. 2018 was an election where Donald Trump had been president for 2 years. And the left was energized and angry. Unfortunately, in the United States, our politics right now is deeply polarized. And the left hates Donald Trump with the white hot passion of 1,000 suns. Beto O'Rourke is a very talented candidate. He ran an impressive campaign, a grassroots campaign that tapped into that anger and rage on the left that was driven by hatred for Trump. He ended up outraising us 3-1, which has been a consistent pattern, getting outraised and outspent 3-1. Which meant, to give a practical sense, he raised about $80 million. To give a practical sense of what that means, our campaign had a total of 18 paid campaign staffers on the campaign. 18. The O'Rourke campaign had 805. That was the differential in manpower. We had 18 people going up against 805. It was as full on an assault as you've ever seen. And O'Rourke campaigned by campaigning hard left and trying to energize every liberal in the state. He also had his hard base was the press, who were in love with him. They treated him like groupies at a Beatles concert. They practically threw their underwear at him as he passed by. Every story written was in this breathy fangirl. Oh, still my beating heart. Beto is the Messiah. And what they ended up doing was extraordinary. They increased Democratic turnout in the state of Texas more than 100%. They took it from 1.8 million Democrats, which is what it showed up the last off-cycle election. They took it from 1.8 million all the way up to 4 million Democrats who showed up on election day. That is a massive increase, particularly for a non-presidential election year. Now, we saw this coming, and so the last 6 weeks in particular, we did a barnstorming tour, got in a bus, and did 50 rallies and town halls all over the state, ringing the bell to turn out voters who don't usually turn out in a midterm election. There are a whole bunch of voters that just historically stay home on midterms and only vote in presidential. And so we were ringing the alarm bell saying, listen, they are coming at us with everything they got. If you don't show up and vote, we could lose the state of Texas. And thankfully, we turned out 4.2 million Republicans. And that was the margin of the victory. And it was a turnout battle where they turned out everyone on the left, and we were able to counteract by getting everyone else out, and that led to a victory.
So 2 years on from this victory in 2018, we find ourselves in the midst of a pandemic. Over the past several weeks especially, you've been hugely critical of China and the CCP, and have gone as far as to say that China is the greatest geopolitical threat the US will face for the next 100 years. To this end, you're bringing 3 bills to Congress this week, the first of which imposes sanctions on those in China who were involved in the cover-up of the COVID-19 crisis in its early days. So could you tell us a bit more about this bill specifically?
Sure. So let me step back for a second and talk about China generally, and then let's talk about it specifically as it concerns COVID-19. I have believed for a long time that China poses the greatest geopolitical threat to the United States and to the United Kingdom, for that matter, over the next century. Last fall, in October, I did an Asia tour, and I traveled to Pearl Harbor, Japan, Taiwan, India, Hong Kong. And that was designed really to be a friends and allies tour, to be traveling to major friends and allies all surrounding China. And the topic of the trip and every discussion was China, what to do with China's rising military power, rising economic power, aggressive use of economic and diplomatic power. I was in Taiwan meeting with President Tsai on Taiwan's National Day, where they celebrate their independence. I was the first US senator to be in Taiwan on National Day in 34 years. China cannot stand that Taiwan exists. They remain embraced in the fiction that there is one China and Taiwan is China. In Hong Kong, we have seen incredibly brave protesters standing up to Chinese oppression, 2 million people taking to the streets. When I was in Hong Kong, I met with a number of the protesters. And in fact, from Hong Kong, did a Sunday show dressed in all black in solidarity with the protesters, because that's what they would dress in when they were protesting, and spoke out. And I said at the time, and I believe, that Hong Kong is the new Berlin. That just as the Berlin Wall symbolized the oppression of the Soviet Union, so too Hong Kong symbolizes the oppression of the Chinese Communist government. And the Chinese Communist government, they are not our friends. And much of the developed world has gotten very naive. Much of my country, much of your country, has gotten very naive in dealing with China, treating them as if they are an ordinary player in the community of civilized nations. China is a country that engages in systematized torture, murder, surveillance, and lies. They murder their own citizens. They have over 1 million of their own citizens, Uyghurs, in concentration camps right now. They routinely lie and engage in propaganda. When it comes to theft, intellectual property theft, look, intellectual property theft has been around as long as the human mind has been creating. You know, the first fellow in a cave that chipped a block of stone into a wheel, I don't doubt that somebody came along and stole the idea and made another wheel. So that ain't new. We've had thieves, we've had industrial espionage, we've had pirates. What we've never had in the history of humanity is a nation state with trillions of dollars of assets that uses theft of intellectual property as a state strategy. And so, for example, when I was in Pearl Harbor meeting with the US Pacific Command, we spent a great deal of time talking about the Chinese military buildup, which is massive. They are investing hundreds of billions of dollars in building up their military capacity, much of which is from technology they've stolen from us. So their approach is go steal the technology so they don't have to engage in the R&D. They don't have those expenses. They just steal the IP and then build the warships. The degree of espionage they engage in, trying to, in the United States, you look at our universities, China has invested millions in infiltrating US universities, in sending over students who are being paid by the Chinese Communist government, who are there to engage in propaganda and espionage. One of our major research institutions described several Chinese nationals studying there at that institution, but also on the payroll of the Chinese government, who would steal cancer research that they were working on, cutting edge cancer research, steal it, send it back to China, and suddenly they would discover the research they were working on, China would go and file for a patent on that research. The identical research, they'd go and take it, and they'd file for a US patent on the research they were working on that they just hadn't gotten to the point to file for a patent. They started seeing that over and over again. All right, with that context, let's shift to coronavirus in particular. China bears enormous responsibility, enormous culpability for the global pandemic and for the deaths that have resulted from this. On multiple levels, let's focus on, first of all, the origin of the virus. We don't know the origin of the virus. We do know that there were not one, but two Chinese labs within miles of the wet market where the outbreak first occurred. These Chinese labs, owned and controlled by the Chinese government, one of them was 300 yards away from the wet market, one of the two. We know that both of these labs were studying viruses. They weren't just studying viruses, they were studying coronaviruses, the specific type of virus that has led to this pandemic. They weren't just studying coronaviruses, they were studying coronaviruses derived from bats. The particular coronavirus, the novel coronavirus that has caused this global pandemic, they believe originated from a type of bat in China that is only found in caves 1,000 miles away. In other words, these bats are not found near Wuhan. You can't naturally find the bats there. You have to go 1,000 miles away. Well, we know that the labs were studying those bats right there. We also know that as the outbreak got more severe, the Chinese government ordered the labs to destroy all the samples they had. Which I'll tell you, having litigated a lot of cases, when you have someone destroy evidence, it raises a strong presumption that there's something in that evidence they wouldn't want people to know. I think the natural inference from what we know is that the virus likely escaped from one of those labs accidentally. That it likely escaped either. We also know, by the way, that both of those labs had very shoddy safety performances, so much so that there were two internal US State Department wires before the pandemic started, raising concerns about the security protocols of these labs and saying if they don't improve these security protocols, it could trigger a worldwide pandemic from a coronavirus. I think what is likely to have occurred is that they accidentally infected either a person or an animal. They didn't do so deliberately. I think just shoddy safety protocols allowed it to happen inadvertently, and then that person or animal in turn infected others. We don't know for sure, but there needs to be a real accountability. There needs to be a real investigation. The Chinese government does not want these questions answered. What we do know for a fact is what happened next, which is once the outbreak started, there were a series of Chinese physicians who bravely and heroically blew the whistle and tried to draw the attention of the Chinese authorities in the world to this outbreak. This is back in December of last year. And they pointed it out, this thing is new, this thing is dangerous, we need to stop it. And the Chinese government responded by punishing them, coming down hard on them, and silencing them. Any ordinary responsible government, if you have an outbreak of this nature, any responsible government would have sent in public health personnel. You would quarantine the infected individuals. And if you had done that at the outset, there's a very real possibility, I believe, that this could have been contained to a regional outbreak rather than a global pandemic. And in a very real sense, China's lies and cover-up are directly responsible for the 250,000 lives that have been lost worldwide, not to mention the trillions of dollars of economic value that has been destroyed from this pandemic, which is their lies and cover-up produced it all.
I do completely take your point about the wider human rights abuses in China, as well as kind of the mismanagement of the crisis when it broke out, the treatment of whistleblowers and so on. But I was just wondering, how do you respond to the criticism that kind of speculations about the origins of the virus and kind of rhetorical wars against China potentially could be unproductive in a time when international cooperation is key to actually now solve the pandemic?
I'd respond a couple of ways. Number one, I don't think truth is counterproductive. And it is, whenever you have a crisis, understanding the true cause and origins of that crisis are important. Number two, I think national security and foreign policy should speak from a premise of truth and reality. We have friends, we have enemies, and we are not helping anyone when we treat our enemies as our friends. They are not doing the same to us. I love the British people. I am an Anglophile through and through. In my office in the Senate, I have 3 busts. I have a bust of Ronald Reagan. I have a bust of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I have a bust of Winston Churchill. By the way, needless to say, that is the only foreign head of state whose bust is in my office. I think Churchill was a leader that not only the United Kingdom, but the entire world needed Churchill where he was. To have the clarity to understand the gathering storm, to have the clarity to understand that Adolf Hitler was who he was. I have joked that there is a reason nobody goes and studies at the Neville Chamberlain School of Foreign Policy. Appeasement doesn't work. Appeasement is a failed policy when dealing with those who seek to do you harm. And so China's objectives, they're not hiding. China is engaged in a 1,000-year plan, and their objective is world domination. They are investing and using every tool they have to get there. You look at their One Belt, One Road initiative, where they go to developing countries and they offer really cheap equipment, hardware. They come in and say, we'll build a port for you, and we'll build it so much cheaper than anybody else. And all you have to do is sign a note to us and make your payments to us, and we'll build it all. And isn't this great? And too many developing countries take those terms and then can't deliver on the loan payments, default on the loan payments, which, by the way, is exactly what China knew they would do. And so then China seizes control of the port. And that's their objective, is to directly dominate the world. Look, if you look at British policy right now, it has been hotly discussed whether the UK should allow Huawei to construct part of the telecom infrastructure for 5G. And from a dollars and cents perspective, it's easy. Listen, China approaches all of these decisions the same way a drug dealer approaches a kid at junior high. which is they come up with a jack and said, hey, try this, it's really cheap. They're giving the equipment away. I get that it's billions of dollars that China's just giving you. That it's pretty attractive for most governments to be given billions of dollars. There is a reason China wants to give billions of dollars of telecom equipment. It's not that they are suddenly altruistic and trying to be the Mother Teresa of telecom. That's not their objective. Their objective is espionage. Huawei is state-owned, state-controlled, and it is a multi-billion-dollar spy agency. And the reason they want to build the equipment is they want to surveil what you're saying and what anyone else is saying in the United Kingdom. And the challenge from our perspective, so the UK is one of the partner nations in what's called the Five Eyes Security Sharing Alliance, and that is our closest allies with whom we share our most sensitive intelligence. The United States urged the UK vigorously, don't go with Huawei for your telecom equipment. Boris Johnson, at least initially, made the decision that he was going to go with it. And the argument was it'll just be 30%, it'll just be on the civilian side. The espionage risk is not as great as you think it is. I can tell you from the United States' perspective, our intelligence agencies believe the espionage risk is serious. And so, I had pressed back vigorously. In fact, I've got a podcast that I'm doing called Verdict with Ted Cruz. And a couple of months ago, I interviewed Nigel Farage, which was a fascinating interview. And one of the things I told Nigel at the time, I said, listen, we love the Brits. You are close friends, allies, partners. But if we're going to share our most sensitive intelligence with you, we have to have confidence that the Chinese are not going to intercept it and read it. And the reason, and this is a phrase that I coined then, I said, look, the reason is 4 eyes are better than 6 eyes. In other words, if the price of sharing intelligence with the Brits is that the Chinese get to read it all, we may just have to contract the intelligence sharing community because we're not willing to hand it over to the Chinese. An interesting observation. So I've said before, I think the most consequential foreign policy and national security result from this pandemic will be the United States, and I hope many other countries in the world, fundamentally reassessing their relationship with China. And I have been encouraged by the early reports that the UK may well be rethinking its decision to go with Huawei for telecom. I hope that the British government does so, that would be the right decision to make if they do.
It's a very, very final question from me before we take one question from the audience. I just wanted to ask about the domestic response in the US to the coronavirus pandemic, particularly in Texas, where kind of it goes without saying that some groups more than others have been disproportionately affected, including women and families due to Governor Abbott's ban on abortions during the pandemic, which has resulted in women having to travel to other states to access these facilities. What are you doing to ensure in Texas and across the United States that the needs of the most vulnerable women and families are being safeguarded?
Well, this is a virus to which everyone is susceptible. That being said, there are particular populations that are uniquely vulnerable. The elderly have shown a particular vulnerability to this virus. Those over 60, even more so those over 70, even more so those over 80. Both my parents are, my dad is 81, my mom is 85. When this started, I called both of them and I said, look, just stay home. Just stay in your apartment. My mom is a 2-time cancer survivor. She's 85. I said, we also know that those with other significant health issues are particularly vulnerable. And I said, look, just stay home and don't go out. It's not worth the risks. I think that makes sense. I think we need to be protecting the most vulnerable population. I think at the same time, we're seeing really two simultaneous crises. One is the global health pandemic, and that is serious, and it has cost way too many lives. And all of us are taking extraordinary steps to flatten the curve and to slow the rate of spread of the virus. We're seeing, secondly, though, an economic crisis, and the economic crisis is staggering. In the United States, it's now over 33 million Americans have lost their jobs in the last 2 months. That's roughly 20% of the entire workforce in the United States has lost their jobs in 2 months. Millions of small businesses are on the verge of going bankrupt. That is very real economic devastation, and that's devastation caused by the government policies put in place to fight the pandemic. I believe our objective should be to protect life and save as many lives as possible. That economic devastation is going to have a real toll in terms of human lives. We know that as people fall into crushing poverty and lose their life savings, we know that you're going to see increased incidences of mental illness, increased incidences of depression, increased rates of suicide, increased substance abuse, increased alcohol abuse. All of that is going to have a cost in terms of human lives. And so what I am urging is that we need to protect life and protect life on both sides of the ledger. And so use common sense, follow medical science to slow the spread of the virus, but also let people get back to work as quickly as possible. Let people provide for their families, let stores open up, let restaurants open up, let hair salons open up. Now, we can do so using common sense, using social distancing, wearing protective equipment. And I think it also will vary geographically. It needs to follow medicine and sound science. So, for example, New York City, the infection rates and death toll there have been horrific and heartbreaking. No one in their right mind would suggest that New Yorkers should go back to work tomorrow. But in the United States, more than 50% of the fatalities that have occurred have been in New York and New Jersey, in very tightly concentrated urban locales. Much of the rest of the country has significantly lower infection rates. My home state of Texas, we have just over 900 fatalities across the state of Texas. Now, that's 900 too many. We grieve for those lives. But out of 29 million people in the state of Texas, that reflects that we have had very real success slowing the spread of this virus. And so what I've been urging is to balance both objectives, fight the virus, but also let people get back to work so that the economy can come roaring back and we can avoid or mitigate all of the harm that comes from voluntarily halting economic production throughout your society.
And do you think specifically policies like, as I said, Abbott's abortion ban, do you think they are productive in helping balance the two objectives that you just said?
Well, the state of Texas had a policy, as other states did, for a period of time prohibiting elective medical procedures, non-necessary, non-urgent medical procedures. They did so because they wanted to preserve medical personnel, they wanted to preserve doctors, they wanted to preserve nurses for a potential upsurge in COVID-19 cases. They were looking at the time at instances like what had happened in Italy, where it was truly heartbreaking what happened in Italy, where the volume overwhelmed their healthcare system. Italy has socialized medicine, and the socialized medicine system did not have the capacity for the surge of patients that they saw. And so the decision to restrict elective procedures was a preventative decision to try to prevent that from happening.
So this one is from Melissa at Pembroke, and she asks, were you happy with Mark Zuckerberg's answer to your political bias, and what have been your best and worst moments in Congress?
Interesting. All right, let's start with the first piece. No, I was not. I think big tech, they are the monopolists of our era. The power that they have arrogated to themselves is breathtaking. and they are engaged in naked political censorship that I think is dangerous, wrong, and the most serious threat we have to our democracy. I've been leading the fight in the Senate to defend free speech. I'm a big believer in free speech. I think, and I agree with John Stuart Mill, that the best solution for bad speech is more speech, not censorship, but more speech. I have chaired numerous hearings on big tech censorship. You know, there was an internal Google document that they prepared where they described that big tech used to be, the US internet companies used to be, embrace a laissez-faire free speech approach to speech on the internet. And the Google document goes on to explain that they have changed their approach now, and they now follow, and this is their own words, a European-style censorship model to restrict what is said. There is zero accountability, by the way. This is quite literally a handful of Silicon Valley billionaires deciding what speech they like and what speech they don't, and they have the ability to just invisibly silence you, to disappear you, without you ever knowing it, where you put a post online, you know, you put this podcast online and suddenly nobody can see it. And you don't even know that nobody can see it. It just, your voice goes out into the ether and disappears. I think that is a profound threat. I've spent a lot of time talking with Zuckerberg. He and I had a one-on-one dinner together, about a 3.5-hour dinner. It was vigorous, to put it mildly. It would, look, to his credit, he wanted to take on my arguments directly, and so we sat around the table and went back and forth. And I will say, of the big tech companies, they're all bad actors. I think Facebook has been the least bad of the bad actors, in that I think Twitter is markedly worse, and I think Google and YouTube, I think Google has changed their motto from do no evil to simply evil. Google is an unchecked, unhampered monopolist, drunk on their own power. And I think it's very dangerous. So how one solves this is complicated. I can tell you, I have spent thousands of hours thinking about it, working with others to do it. I do not think we want to allow our speech to be censored by oligarchs with complete power. Second question was most fun, least fun. All right, most fun. Several years ago, traveled to Israel, was in Jerusalem, meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I've gotten to know Bibi quite well. He's become a friend. But came to his office. Most of the meetings when you meet with him are, he has a conference room, kind of a big conference room next to his office. They're typically at the conference room with lots of sort of diplomatic people sitting there. This particular trip, I wanted to have a one-on-one meeting with him. I'll actually give you an interesting, some backstory on this. So this is during the Obama administration. The U.S. ambassador to Israel is a fellow named Daniel Shapiro, very, very nice fellow. And he was there, and it was the day before the meeting with Bibi, and our ambassador said, so you're not meeting with Bibi without me being there? And I said, well, yes, I am. And he said, no, you are not. I am not going to allow you to do that meeting. And I said, well, that's very interesting. I'm going to do it anyway. And he said, well, then I'll pull your security. So the embassy was providing my security there. Now, I got to say, it was pretty self-evidently a bluff. I was quite confident that they didn't really want a U.S. senator to be in Israel without security. But even if it wasn't a bluff, I said, okay, that's fine. We'll hire private security within the hour. We'll be fine. And I said, look, this is a private trip. This is not a Codel. This meeting was arranged on my own. I arranged this meeting, and you're not invited. And what was interesting, so Daniel's kind of a small guy, and we were standing outside the Knesset, and we were literally bumping chests. I mean, it was junior high. I mean, we were in each other's face, bumping chests. And I simply said, you are not invited, and you're not welcome at the meeting. Fast forward the next day, Daniel left. He didn't go to the meeting, and we had it prearranged where I went to the conference room, and Bibi said, Ted, come on back to my office. So the two of us go back to his office, and we pull out cigars, Cuban cigars, Montecristos. And I sat in his office and smoked a Cuban cigar with Bibi. And for about an hour and a half, discussed global politics, security. And Netanyahu is someone who, at this point, I've met a lot of world leaders. Few, if any, have impressed me as much as Netanyahu has in terms of the seriousness with which he takes national security, the knowledge. I think particularly dealing with Iran and the threat of a nuclear Iran, I think Netanyahu has fulfilled a Churchillian role, and that's an adjective I've used for him multiple times. So sitting there in his office, smoking a cigar with Bibi Netanyahu, talking about geopolitics, I got to admit that was a holy cow moment where you just kind of shake your head and wonder, what on earth am I doing here? Least favorite, which I'll do in 5 seconds.
I'm aware your is wanting you to wrap up, but yeah, continue.
Yeah, no, I've got a markup in the Senate that I'm getting. Oh yeah, I'm getting lit up on my phone to go to a markup. Least favorite is the time I spend away from my kids. Every Monday morning, I get on a plane and fly from Houston to DC, and I typically fly back Thursday night. And my girls are 9 and 12, and it's hard. It is really hard to be away from the family. I mean, they pay a price. They were little bitty. They were 2 and 4 when I was elected to the Senate. They pay a price that's not fair. They didn't sign up to do this. I did this. And so that's by far the hardest part. You try to make it work, but it's not easy. All right, now I'm really getting lit up.
Thank you very much for joining us, Senator Cruz. It has been a pleasure hosting you. Thank you.